Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world had burned. Terrande Whisperwind stood among the ashes of what had once been a peaceful night elf village. The air thick with the acrid stench of smoke and blood pressed down on her like a suffocating veil. Her heart ached as she looked over the wounded and the dead. The once proud trees which had provided both shelter and sustenance for her people lay toppled like the fallen sentinels they had been. The whispers of the wind through the leaves were replaced with the cries of the injured and the mournful wails of survivors searching for loved ones. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her fingers digging into the scorched earth. "Eluni," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of commanding in battle. "Dare, please. I need your guidance. I need your strength." But there was only silence. Tyranne's eyes squeezed shut as her breath hitched in her throat. This war with the Burning Legion had ravaged everything in its path. She had fought fiercely alongside her beloved Malfurion and the brave warriors of their people. But the cost had been so great, too great. And now when she needed her goddess the most, Elune, her beloved, revered Elune, had abandoned her. Tyrande. Malfurion's voice was soft, yet steady, a grounding presence in the chaos surrounding them. She felt his hand rest gently on her shoulder. Didn't he need to turn to know that his expression would be one of quiet concern? He always knew when she was struggling. He could always sense when the weight of leadership was too much for her to bear alone. "I prayed to her," Tyrande said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I prayed, and she was silent." Malfurion knelt beside her, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield. "Perhaps her silence is not a rejection. Sometimes the gods choose not to answer, so we may find the strength within ourselves." Tyrande opened her eyes, staring down at her hands. They were stained with blood, her own and others. "How can I lead our people when I feel so abandoned?" Malfurion's grip on her shoulder tightened ever so slightly. "You've led them, Tyrande. Flight has guided you, yes, but it is your strength, your love for your people that has carried us through the darkest time." But without her, Tyrande trailed off, unable to finish the thought. She was too afraid of the truth in her own words. Malfurion rose to his feet, his tall figure casting a long shadow over her. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand to help her up. "There is a place, a temple, to Elune, long forgotten by all but the eldest druids. Perhaps it holds the answers you seek." Tyrande hesitated. Her instinct was to stay to help her people rebuild, to tend to the wounded. But something deeper, more primal, stirred within her. She needed to know why Elune had forsaken her. She needed to understand why the goddess had remained silent during their darkest hour. She took Malfurion's fell hand and stood. "We'll go," she said, her voice firmer now, "but we must be swift. Our people can afford for their leader to be absent for long." Malfurion nodded, his face as impassive as ever, though she knew him well enough to see the flicker of concern in his eye. He had always been the calm to her storm, but even now she could feel the weight of his own burden. The devastation of their land had affected him deeply, though he hid it behind his stoic demeanor. Together they set off toward the distant mountains where the ancient temple awaited. The journey was long and arduous. The path to the temple had been lost to time, overgrown with thick vines and dense underbrush. Malfurion led the way, his druidic magic coaxing the wilds to part for them, but even his abilities seemed strained. The land itself was wounded, just as they were, and nature's magic responded sluggishly, as though the earth mourned the loss of life that had once flourished here. Tyrande walked in silence, her thoughts consumed by doubt. She could feel Malfurion's steady presence beside her, but even he couldn't. He eased the turmoil in her heart. The goddess she had dedicated her entire life to had turned away from her. It wasn't just the silence, it was the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. For the first time in her life, Tyrande felt truly alone. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder and the trees thinner. The wind howled through the rocky crags, a mournful sound that only deepened her sense of isolation. She clutched her cloak tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the path ahead, though her mind was miles away. "What if there is no answer?" she finally asked, breaking the silence between them. "What if Elune truly has forsaken us?" Malfurion paused, turning to face her. His brow was furrowed in thought, and for a moment he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "Faith is not always rewarded with answers. Tyr knows sometimes the silence is itself the lesson." Tyrande shook her head, her frustration boiling over. And what lesson is that? That we are alone in our struggles, that the goddess we have worshipped for millennia will simply turn her back on us when we need her the most. Malfurion sighed, his eyes searching hers. Perhaps the lesson is that we must learn to stand on our own without relying on the divine. His words struck her like a blow to the chest, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Stand on her own without Elune. The very thought was unbearable. Elune had been her guiding light, her source of strength for as long as she could remember without the goddess' presence. Who was she? They continued on in silence, the weight of Malfurion's words hanging between them like a storm cloud. Tyrannide's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling into a dark pit of doubt and fear. She had always been strong, but now, for the first time, she questioned whether her strength had been her own or merely a gift from Elune. The temple loomed ahead, its crumbling spires barely visible through the mist that clung to the mountainside. The sight of it sent a chill down Tyrannide's spine. This place was ancient, far older than even the oldest records in the Night Elf archive. It had been forgotten for good reason, perhaps because the answers it held were not meant to be found. As they approached the entrance, Malfurion paused, placing a hand on her arm. Are you ready for what you might find here? Tyrande swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She did not. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready, but she had come this far, and turning back now would mean living with the uncertainty forever. I have to be, she said quietly, stepping forward into the temple's shadow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ancient stone. The temple was eerily quiet, save for the soft echoes of their footsteps as they ventured deeper into its depth. Faded murals lined the walls, depicting scenes of Elune in her various forms, maiden, mother, and crone. Tyrande felt a pang of sorrow as she looked upon them, the images of her goddess, now seeming distant, almost alien. They reached the heart of the temple, a circular chamber with a large cracked altar at its center. Moonlight filtered in through a hole in the ceiling, casting a pale glow over the altar and the intricate patterns carved into the stone floor. Tyrande's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the altar. This was where the goddess had once communed with her most devoted followers, but now it was as empty and desolate as the land outside. She stepped forward, her hand brushing against the cold stone. Elune, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why have you forsaken me? There was no answer. Only the silence of the forgotten temple. Tyrande's knees buckled, and she collapsed before the altar, her head bowed in despair. She had come all this way, searching for answers, only to find more emptiness. Her tears fell freely, soaking into the cracks of the ancient stone. Malfurion knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Tyrande, I don't understand, she sobbed. By one T she answered me. Why now when we need her most? Malfurion's hand gently cupped her chin, lifting her face to meet his gaze. Perhaps it is not Elune who must answer, he said softly. Perhaps the answer lies within you. Tyrande stared at him through her tears, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it be true? Could the silence of the goddess be a test, not of her faith, but of her strength? Tyrande stared at him through her tears, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it be true? Could the silence of the goddess be a test, not of her faith, but of her strength? She had always believed that Elune's guidance was her path, her calling. Yet here in the heart of the forgotten temple, it felt like the goddess was farther away than ever. The thought was unbearable. The idea that the being she had dedicated her life to had turned away in her people's greatest time of need. Malfurion's words lingered in her mind as the wind seemed to die down outside, the oppressive silence of the temple matching the void in her soul. She wanted to believe that the answer lay within her, that she had always possessed the strength to carry her people through this crisis. But how could that be true when she felt so broken, so lost? Malfurion watched her carefully, his eyes filled with concern, but he didn't press her for an answer. Instead, he sat beside her in quiet solidarity, a reminder that while she might feel alone in her struggle, she was not without ally. She closed her eyes, trying to find some semblance of peace within herself. Her breathing slowed as she focused inward, searching for the connection to her goddess that had always been there like a soft whisper at the edge of her consciousness. But there was nothing, no voice, no warmth, not even the faintest flicker of divine presence. It was as if Elune had been erased from existence. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palm. Anger bubbled up from deep within her, and before she could stop herself, she slammed her fist into the cold stone of the altar. "Why?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty chamber. "Dear, why won't you answer me?" Her words hung in the air, unanswered, the emptiness swallowing her cries of desperation. She felt Malfurion set her hand on her arm, but she shrugged it off, her frustration overwhelming her. All these years, all the sacrifices she had made for her people, for her faith, and now when everything was falling apart, Elune had abandoned her. She stood up, her hands shaking with rage. "I've given everything for you, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I've fought for you, I've led my people in your name, and now when I need you the most, you turn your back on me." Malfurion remained silent, letting her vent her anger. He understood that this was a battle she needed to fight within herself, a journey she had to complete alone, even if he stood by her side. Tyrande paced back and forth in front of the altar, her emotions swirling in a storm of confusion and pain. Every memory she had of Elune felt tainted now. The goddess silence like a betrayal. But as the minutes passed, her anger began to fade, leaving only a hollow ache in its place. She sank to her knees once more, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know how to lead without her." Malfurion knelt beside her again, his voice gentle. "Can't you have always led, Tyrande? Ilunia's light may have guided you, but it has always been your strength, your heart, that carried our people. That is why they follow you, not because of the goddess, but because they believe in you." Tyrande closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that she could lead without Elune's light. But the fear gnawed at her, the fear that she was not enough on her own. After what felt like an eternity, she opened her eyes and looked up at the altar, the cracked stone now bathed in the soft light of the moon filtering through the temple's broken ceiling. The sight filled her with a strange sense of calm. Perhaps it wasn't her. The goddess' silence, that was the problem. Perhaps it was her own inability to hear what had always been there. She took a deep breath, focusing on the moonlight, feeling its gentle warmth on her skin. It wasn't Elune's voice, but it was something, a connection to the world, to the life that still pulsed outside the temple. Slowly she rose to her feet, her legs shaky but steady enough to hold her. Malfurion stood as well, watching her closely. "Right, what are you thinking?" he asked, his tone cautious. Tyrande didn't answer immediately. She gazed up at the moonlight, letting the silence settle between them. For the first time since she had entered the temple, the emptiness in her chest didn't feel quite so overwhelming. "I think," she said softly, "that I've been looking for the wrong answer." Malfurion raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt her. Tyrande turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "All my life I have relied on Elune for guidance, for strength. But maybe that's not the problem. Maybe I've been so focused on what I thought I needed from her that I forgot what I already had." Malfurion's lips curved into a small smile. "You've always had the strength, Tyrande. It was never about Elune." Tyrande nodded slowly, the realization settling deep in her bones. It wasn't that Elune had forsaken her. The goddess' silence was not a punishment, nor was it a sign of abandonment. It was a reminder, a challenge. Elune had given her all the tools she needed, but it was up to Tyrande to use them. "I've been so focused on asking for help," she continued, her voice stronger now. "Dear, that I forgot my duty is to lead. Elune is not here to fight our battles for us. She never was." Malfurion's smile widened. "And now you see the truth. You don't need her voice to guide you, Tyrande. You've always known what needs to be done." Tyrande felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The weight of doubt that had pressed down on her lifted, and in its place, there was a quiet resolve. She looked at the altar one last time, the cracked stone illuminated by the gentle glow of the moon. This journey had given her clarity. She didn't need to hear Elune's voice to know what was right. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were for Elune, for Malfurion, or for herself. She turned to Malfurion, her eyes clear and determined. "Cray, we need to go back. Our people are waiting for us." Malfurion nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. "He lead the way, my love." And so they left the temple, the journey back through the mountains, much lighter than the one that had brought them here. The path was still rugged, The land still scarred by war, but Tyranniel's heart no longer felt weighed down by uncertainty. She had found her strength not in the words of a goddess, but in the knowledge that she was enough. When they returned to their people, Tyrannie stood before them, her presence commanding, her voice unwavering. The night elves looked to her not for divine intervention, but for the leadership she had always provided. She spoke to them not as the chosen of Elune, but as their leader, their protector, their guide through the darkness. And in that moment, as the moonlight bathed the land in its soft glow, Tyrannie understood the true meaning of faith. It wasn't really about waiting for answers from the divine. It was about finding the strength within to forge ahead, no matter how uncertain the path.